She kept forgiving people who never changed. A story of Adi's full narration script. Intro. Welcome, dear listener. Today, we are going to sit together, the way our people sit under the mango tree in the cool of the evening, and share a story. A story that is not just about one woman, but about many of us. About the quiet battles we fight inside our hearts. About the people we love too deeply, forgive too quickly, and hold on to too long. This is the story of Adis. And if you listen carefully, you may find pieces of yourself in her. Episode 1, The Girl Everyone Leaned On. In a quiet village tucked deep in the heart of Nigeria, one of those villages where the morning mist still hangs low over the cassava farms, where the sound of the mortar and pestle wakes you before the rooster does, life moved slowly. But emotionally, it moved very heavily. The Igbo people have a saying, Oni wetera aji, wetera no. He who brings kola nut brings life. It is a proverb about generosity. About the one who shows up. About the one who gives. And in this village, that person was Adis. She was not the loudest in the village. She was not the richest. She was not the most influential. But she was the one everyone ran to when life became unbearable. If a child fell sick in the middle of the night, they came to her house first, before they even thought of the medicine man. If a marriage was breaking apart, the couple sat with Adis under the mango tree, not because she had all the answers, but because she made people feel heard. If someone had no money for food, they cried on her shoulder before they even thought of solutions. Adis listened. That was her gift. She listened without interrupting. Without judging. Without turning people away. Even when she was tired. Even when her own back ached from the day's work. Even when her own heart was heavy with things she had not told anyone. In Igbo culture, there is a deep value placed on community, on Igwebike, which means unity is strength. The community comes before the individual. You carry your neighbor's burden as your own. You do not let your brother fall without reaching out your hand. Adis had absorbed this value deeply. Perhaps too deeply. Because there was something people did not notice about her kindness, it had slowly become an expectation. Not a choice she made freely anymore, but a role the village assigned her. And Adis accepted it. Because in her mind, being needed meant being loved. And being loved meant never saying no. She didn't realize that sometimes, being everyone's safe place means you stop having a place to be safe yourself. Psychologists call this fawning, a trauma response where a person constantly prioritizes others' needs to avoid conflict, to feel accepted, to feel worthy. It is not weakness. It is a pattern that often begins in childhood, when a person learns that love is conditional, that they must earn it through service, through sacrifice, through silence. Adis had learned this lesson without anyone teaching it to her directly. She had simply observed, absorbed, and become. Episode 2, the first time she was disrespected. The first real crack in Adis' heart did not come with shouting or dramatic betrayal. It came quietly, wrapped in the comfortable cloth of familiarity. Her cousin Namdi had always been close to her. They grew up like siblings, sharing the same compound, eating from the same pot, running to the same grandmother when they were in trouble. He was the kind of person who could make people laugh even in the most serious situations. His laughter was loud, his stories were always exaggerated, and his presence filled every room he entered. So when he came to her one warm afternoon, sitting across from her with that familiar grin, asking for money, she didn't hesitate. I will return it next week, he promised, hand pressed firmly to his chest in that gesture that Nigerians used to say, I am serious. I mean this. Trust me. Adis smiled. She trusted him. But weeks passed. Then months. The money did not return. And neither did the conversation about it. When she gently reminded him, carefully, softly, the way you remind family because you don't want to cause offense, he laughed it off. "Oh, Addis. Why are you counting family money like a banker?" He said it jokingly. But it landed differently in her heart. Like her trust was something funny. Something not serious enough to respect. Like the fact that she had given from her own savings was irrelevant because they were family, and family doesn't keep records. But here is what nobody told Addis: keeping records is not a lack of love. It is a form of self-respect. Still, she didn't push further. Because in her village, and in many Nigerian communities, holding family accountable felt like disrespect. There is a cultural pressure to absorb, to forgive, to move on. To say, "Imila, it is done," and let it go. So she swallowed the disappointment and told herself, he will pay when he can. But what she didn't understand was this: people often repeat behavior that is never challenged. When there are no consequences, there is no reason to change. And that was the beginning of a pattern she would live with for years. Episode 3: The Friend Who Crossed Lines But Never Lost Access. Chima was Addis' childhood friend. They grew up running barefoot on the same dusty roads, chasing chickens through the compound, sharing roasted corn by the fire in the evenings. He was the kind of friend who made every gathering lively, the one who remembered everyone's embarrassing stories and told them at the worst possible moments, but always with a smile that made it hard to stay angry. But as they grew older, something changed in Chima. Or perhaps it didn't change, perhaps it was always there, and Addis had simply not noticed it when they were children. Chima became careless with his words. At first, it was small jokes. "You and your seriousness, no wonder nobody has carried you yet." Meaning, no wonder no man has married you. People laughed. Addis smiled politely, even though something inside her tightened like a knot. Then the jokes became sharper. He would correct her loudly in front of people, not gently, not privately, but publicly, as if correcting her was a performance for the audience. He would interrupt her stories halfway through. He would downplay her achievements with phrases like, "Oh, that one is nothing, many people have done it." Whenever she tried to express discomfort, he would say, "Relax, I'm just joking." And that phrase, "I'm just joking," became his shield. His escape route. His way of crossing boundaries without consequences. Because just joking allowed him to say harmful things and then transfer the responsibility to the person who was hurt. If you were offended, you were the problem. You were too sensitive. You couldn't take a joke. This is what psychologists call minimization, a form of emotional manipulation where the person causing harm reduces the impact of their behavior to avoid accountability. Addis never wanted to lose him as a friend. They had history. They had memories. They had grown up together, and in Nigerian culture, that kind of bond is not easily discarded. So she kept forgiving him. Kept adjusting. Kept understanding. But slowly, she was not laughing with him anymore. She was laughing to avoid conflict. And there is a profound difference between joy and survival laughter. One comes from the heart. The other comes from fear. Episode 4, Love That Took More Than It Gave. Then came Hugo. He was different at first. Or at least, he seemed different. Calm voice. Strong presence. Big dreams. He spoke about building a future, leaving the village, achieving something meaningful in life. He had a way of speaking that made you feel like the world was full of possibilities, like with him, things could be different. Addis believed him deeply. When he said he loved her, she believed it meant care, respect, effort. She believed love was something you could see in a person's actions, not just hear in their words. But over time, Hugo started changing, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually in ways that were hard to name at first. The kind of changes that make you question your own perception. That make you wonder if you are imagining things. He stopped checking on her the way he used to. He started responding late, sometimes hours, sometimes days. He began dismissing her emotions as too much. If Adis cried, he would say, "You are too emotional." If she questioned his behavior, he would say, "You are overthinking." And when she stayed quiet to avoid conflict, he would say, "You are changing." This is a pattern that mental health professionals recognize as emotional gaslighting, where a person consistently makes their partner doubt their own feelings, perceptions, and reactions. It is subtle. It is slow. And it is deeply damaging. Because what Hugo was doing, whether consciously or not, was teaching Adis that her emotions were the problem. That her needs were inconvenient. That her voice was too loud even when she was barely whispering. But what he didn't realize was that she was not changing, she was shrinking. Because she was trying so hard to keep peace that she lost her voice in the process. Still, she forgave him every time. Because she believed love required endurance. Because she had been taught that a good woman holds on. That patience is a virtue. That love is not easy, and you must fight for it. But what she didn't know was that endurance without respect slowly turns into emotional exhaustion. And emotional exhaustion, if left unaddressed, turns into something much darker, a quiet loss of self. Episode 5, The Village Wisdom She Ignored. One evening, while fetching water from the stream, that same stream where the women of the village had gathered for generations, washing clothes, sharing news, solving problems that no council of men ever knew about, Adis aunt noticed her silence. Her aunt was one of those women who had lived long enough to recognize pain even when it wore a smile. She had buried a husband, raised children alone, survived seasons of drought and plenty, and still moved through life with a quiet dignity that commanded respect without demanding it. She had always been observant, the kind of woman who didn't need explanations to understand what was happening. "You are carrying too much in your heart," her aunt said softly, not looking at her, just watching the water flow. Adis smiled faintly. "I am fine." Her aunt shook her head slowly. "No, my child. You are forgiving people who are not changing. That is not kindness anymore. That is self-harm." Adis paused. The water continued to flow. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out. "But what if they change one day?" Adis asked, and in her voice was all the hope she had been carrying, the hope that had kept her going, that had made every disappointment bearable. Her aunt looked at her for a long moment. The kind of look that carries a whole conversation. "And what if you break before that day comes?" That question stayed in the air longer than the conversation itself. It floated there, between the sound of the water and the rustling of the leaves, and it found its way into Adis' heart, even if she wasn't ready to act on it yet. In Igbo tradition, the wisdom of elders is considered sacred. There is a proverb, "Oni no ochicho obiyu oni ochicho nwaya," the one who has desire is owned by that desire. Adis' desire to be loved, to be needed, to be seen as good, it was owning her. But Adis, like many people who believe deeply in love and loyalty, chose hope over warning. And that choice would cost her more than she understood at the time. Episode 6, When Patterns Become Normal. As months passed, nothing changed, but Adis' tolerance increased. And this is perhaps the most dangerous part of any cycle of hurt, not the initial pain, but the normalization. The moment when what was once unacceptable becomes expected. When you stop being shocked. When you start making excuses before the person even offers one. Namdi still didn't return the money. Chima still made disrespectful jokes. Hugo still dismissed her feelings. But Adi stayed consistent in one thing: she forgave them all. Not because they changed, but because she didn't know how to stop forgiving. Because stopping felt like giving up. Because giving up felt like failure. Because failure felt like she was the problem. This is the trap that many kind-hearted people fall into. They believe that if they just love harder, forgive more, understand deeper, the other person will eventually see it and change. But the truth that nobody tells you is this: your forgiveness cannot change someone who does not want to change. People around her started noticing something strange. She was always the one hurt, but never the one holding people accountable. She was always the one adjusting, but no one was adjusting for her. And because there were no consequences, the behavior continued. In her village, people began to say, "Adis has a soft heart." They meant it as a compliment. But what they didn't see was that softness without boundaries becomes a target. Kindness without limits becomes exploitation. And a heart that never says no eventually becomes a heart that is taken for granted. Episode 7: The Breaking Point at the River. One evening, Adis walked alone to the river behind the village. The river was one of those places that held the memory of the village, where children learned to swim, where women washed and talked, where young couples met in secret, where old men sat and remembered. The river had seen everything. The water moved slowly, reflecting the orange and gold of the sky as the sun began its descent. The air was warm but not heavy. The kind of evening that feels like the world is pausing to breathe. She sat quietly on a smooth stone at the water's edge, her reflection slightly distorted by the ripples. For the first time in a long time, she didn't think about others. She thought about herself. About how many times she had been hurt and said nothing. About how many apologies she had accepted without seeing any real change. About how many chances she had given that turned into cycles: the same behavior, the same apology, the same forgiveness, the same behavior again. And something inside her finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Like a thread that had been stretched too far for too long and finally, quietly, snapped. Not anger. Not bitterness. Clarity. She whispered to herself, almost to the river, almost to the orange sky. I keep forgiving the same pain wearing different faces. And that realization hurt more than any betrayal. Because it meant the problem was not only them. It was also her pattern. Her choices. Her silence. Her endless capacity to absorb what she should have rejected. This is what therapists call the aha moment, the moment of self-awareness that precedes real change. It doesn't always feel good. In fact, it often feels like grief. Because you are not just recognizing what others did to you, you are recognizing what you allowed, and that is a much harder truth to sit with. But it is also the beginning of freedom. Episode 8: The First Boundary. The next time Chima came with his usual apology, something was different. He arrived with that familiar smile, the one that had always worked before. The one that said, "We are friends, this is nothing serious, let us move on." He smiled like nothing had happened. Like the wound he had caused had already healed itself without his help. "NNE, you know I didn't mean it like that. I'm sorry again." The word again was telling. Because it acknowledged that this had happened before. That this was a pattern. And yet, he offered the same apology, expecting the same result. Adis looked at him for a long moment. Not angry. Not emotional. Not ready to cry or to shout. Just aware. And then she said something she had never said before in all the years of their friendship. I hear your apology. But I cannot keep repeating this cycle with you. Chima blinked. Confused. This was not the script he knew. So now you are forming strong, he said, a Nigerian phrase meaning, so now you are acting tough. So now you are pretending to be someone you are not. But Adeez didn't react. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize for her boundary. Because for the first time, silence was her answer, not forgiveness. And that silence carried more power than all her previous patience combined. Setting a boundary is not an act of aggression. It is an act of self-respect. It is saying, I value myself enough to tell you what I will and will not accept. And if you cannot respect that, then the relationship must change. It is one of the hardest things a person can do, especially in cultures where keeping peace is valued above personal truth. But it is also one of the most necessary. Episode 9, Letting Go Without Noise. With Hugo, the ending was not dramatic. There was no shouting. No long argument. No emotional explosion that the whole village would hear about and discuss for weeks. No dramatic scene at the market or the stream. Just a conversation that changed everything. I forgive you, Adeez said quietly. And she meant it. She had forgiven him, truly, deeply, without bitterness. But I cannot stay in this pattern anymore. Hugo tried to respond. He had his words ready, the explanations, the promises, the reminders of the good times. But there was nothing left to negotiate. Because she was no longer trying to fix something that repeatedly broke her. She was not angry. She was not seeking revenge. She was simply stepping away. And that was unfamiliar to her, but necessary. There is a wisdom in the Igbo proverb, Oni wetera aji, wetera ndu, but there is also wisdom in knowing when the kola nut has been refused. When what you offer is not valued, continuing to offer it is not generosity. It is self-abandonment. Letting go of someone you love, especially someone you have invested years of forgiveness and hope in, is one of the most painful things a human being can do. It does not feel like strength in the moment. It feels like loss. But sometimes, letting go is the most loving thing you can do, for yourself, and even for the other person. Because staying in a broken pattern does not help anyone grow. Episode 10, What People Don't See After Forgiveness Ends. In small communities in Nigeria, in villages where everyone knows everyone, where your business is also your neighbor's business, where change is noticed and discussed, Adeez's transformation did not go unnoticed. People started talking. She has changed. She is now proud. She doesn't forgive anymore. She thinks she is better than us now. The village had a version of Adeez that it was comfortable with, the one who absorbed, who forgave, who never said no. And when that version began to disappear, people felt unsettled. Because her boundaries were inconvenient for those who had benefited from her lack of them. But what they called pride was actually healing. What they called change was actually survival. What they called coldness was actually a woman learning, for the first time, to protect her own heart. Because Adeez finally understood something important, forgiveness is beautiful only when it leads to change, not when it enables repetition. Forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. You can forgive someone and still choose not to continue a relationship with them. You can release the bitterness without reopening the door. You can wish someone well from a distance. This is a distinction that many people, especially in communities where forgiveness is seen as an obligation, struggle to understand. But it is a vital one. Episode 11, Rebuilding Herself Quietly. Adeez didn't suddenly become cold. She didn't stop loving people. She didn't build a wall around her heart and refuse to let anyone in. She just started loving herself equally. She spent more time alone under the mango tree, not waiting for people to come to her with their problems, not waiting to be needed, but simply sitting with herself. Rediscovering her own thoughts. Remembering what she liked, what she wanted, what she dreamed about before she became everyone's solution. She started helping people who respected her time. She started saying yes only when she meant it. She started saying no without apologizing for it. She smiled, but no longer forced herself into roles that drained her. She was kind, but no longer at the expense of her own peace. And slowly, something began to return to her life. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But quietly, like the first light of dawn, so gradual you almost don't notice it until suddenly, you realize the darkness is gone. Peace. Not loud peace. Not the kind that announces itself. But quiet peace. The kind that doesn't need validation. The kind that exists simply because you have stopped fighting against yourself. Episode 12, When Old Patterns Return. As expected, people came back. Because that is what people do when they realize they have lost access to something they took for granted. Nnamdi returned with promises, this time more elaborate, more convincing. Chima returned with apologies, this time more sincere sounding, more emotional. Even Hugo sent messages again, carefully worded, full of reflection and regret. And Adis listened. Because she was not a bitter woman. She had not become hard or unfeeling. She still had the capacity for love and compassion that had always defined her. But she was no longer the same woman. She listened. She observed. She paused, that pause that comes from wisdom rather than confusion. And sometimes, she said no. Not out of bitterness. Not out of revenge. Not to prove a point. But out of wisdom. Because she finally understood something that her aunt had tried to tell her years ago, something that the river had whispered to her on that quiet evening. Some people don't change because they lost you. They only come back because they lost access. There is a difference between someone who misses you and someone who misses what you gave them. And learning to tell the difference, that is one of the most important skills a person can develop. Episode 13, The Village Finally Notices. Change, when it is real, cannot be hidden. The village noticed that Adis was different. But this time, some of them noticed in a different way. Not with judgment, but with something closer to admiration. The younger women began to watch her. To observe how she moved through the village with a new kind of quiet confidence. How she helped when she chose to, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she didn't. How she spoke with a directness that was still gentle but no longer apologetic. One evening, her grandmother, the oldest woman in the family, the one whose words carried the weight of decades, sat with her under the mango tree. She looked at Adis for a long time. The way old people look at you when they are reading something in your face that you cannot see yourself. And then she said, "My child, you are no longer breaking for people who refuse to change. That is growth." Adis smiled. Not because life had become perfect. Life was still complicated. People were still complicated. The village was still the village. But because she finally stopped sacrificing herself for the illusion of change. Because she had learned the difference between hope and delusion. Between patience and self-destruction. And that knowledge, that quiet, hard-won knowledge, was worth everything she had been through. Episode 14, Peace Feels Different. Peace did not arrive dramatically. It did not come with a celebration or an announcement. There was no moment where Adis stood on a hill and declared that she was healed, that she was whole, that everything was finally okay. It arrived slowly. In quiet mornings when she woke up without the weight of other people's expectations pressing on her chest. In lighter conversations where she spoke freely without calculating how her words would be received. In fewer emotional ones, not because the world had become kinder, but because she had become wiser about who she allowed close to her heart. Adi still lived in the same village in Nigeria. The same mango tree. The same stream. The same red earth roads. The same faces she had known all her life. But she was no longer the same person inside it. And that is perhaps the most profound kind of change, not the change of place or circumstance, but the change of self. The change that happens quietly, internally, in the space between who you were and who you are becoming. Episode 15, The Final Understanding. One evening, sitting under the stars, the kind of stars that only appear in villages far from city lights, thick and bright and close enough to feel like they are listening, Adis finally understood everything. Not with bitterness. Not with regret. But with the kind of clarity that comes only after you have walked through fire and come out the other side. Forgiveness is powerful. It releases you from the prison of resentment. It frees you from the weight of anger. It allows you to move forward without carrying the past like a stone on your back. But wisdom is knowing when forgiveness should stop repeating cycles and start protecting your peace. Wisdom is understanding that you can forgive someone completely and still choose not to give them access to hurt you again. That forgiveness is for you, not for them. That it is a gift you give yourself, not a permission slip you hand to others. And for the first time in her life, Adis didn't just forgive others. She forgave herself. She forgave herself for staying too long. For believing promises that were never kept. For shrinking herself to fit into spaces that were never meant for her. For confusing endurance with love, and silence with peace. She forgave herself, and in doing so, she finally became free. Closing, lessons from the story. And so, dear listener, as we come to the end of Adi's story, let us sit with what she has taught us. Because this is not just her story. It is the story of every person who has ever loved too freely and been taken for granted. Every person who has ever forgiven too quickly and been hurt again. Every person who has ever stayed too long in a cycle that was breaking them, because they believed that their love could change someone who did not want to be changed. The first lesson, forgiving without change keeps you stuck in cycles. Forgiveness is not a reset button. It does not erase what happened or guarantee that it will not happen again. True forgiveness must be accompanied by changed behavior, otherwise, it is simply an invitation to repeat the same pain. The second lesson, some people only respect boundaries when you enforce them. You cannot explain your way to respect. You cannot love your way to it. You cannot forgive your way to it. Respect is earned through consistency, and sometimes, the only language some people understand is consequence. The third lesson, love without self-respect leads to emotional exhaustion. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot give what you do not have. And if you spend all your love on others without keeping any for yourself, you will eventually have nothing left, not for them, and not for you. The fourth lesson, patterns matter more than promises. Anyone can make a promise. Words are easy. But patterns, the repeated, consistent behavior over time, that is where the truth lives. Watch what people do, not just what they say. And the fifth lesson, peace begins when you stop repeating what keeps breaking you. Peace is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of boundaries. It is the courage to say, I will not continue to accept what diminishes me. I will not keep giving access to those who do not value what I offer. Adis found her peace. Not in a different village. Not in different people. But in herself. And so can you? Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because somewhere out there is another Addis, still forgiving, still hoping, still waiting for the change that never comes. And maybe, just maybe, this story will be the voice that speaks to them the way the river spoke to Addis on that quiet evening. Until next time, take care of yourself. You deserve it.